Tonight we're gonna mostly be in Ecclesiastes 1 and Revelation 21. So if you had to keep your fingers anywhere, that's where you're gonna keep them. You'll have to excuse me if I move between verses a little fast. I like to have those verses that I intend to read from in my notes. I find that I often take just so long turning between passages. I'm going to start off with Ecclesiastes 1, verses 1 and 2. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. So here, the title of this message is Vanity and Prophecy. And why in Ecclesiastes those two words are absolutely connected. So to understand that connection, well, we can first understand what a vain process is, or what vanity is, plainly speaking. So if something is a vain process, it's a futile process. It means it accomplishes nothing. For example, the phrase to have done something in vain, it means to have attempted something to no avail, to futile ends. Right? Now, why does vanity exist in the world? Because sin exists in the world. Thusly, if something is declared vain, then we can understand that along with sin, it'll be cast out one day. So everything, every process which Solomon deems vain, that's a prophetic action. To call a process vain is to say one day this will no longer be. Very interesting when Solomon's examples are very, very specific, right? So we can logically work out that what Solomon is doing is prophetic, but we can do so much more than that. We can validate that what he's saying is prophetic with scripture. And we're going to do that today. We're going to do a lot of that today. So here in Ecclesiastes 1, 3 through 4, it says, what profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? One generation passes away and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. Now, I said earlier, have a finger in Revelation 21, and we're going to be in there a lot. There's going to be some rapid fire, hopefully not too rapid back and forth between these two chapters, and we'll find that they're so absolutely connected that to me, it's something that once you see it, you can't unsee it. In Revelation 21, verse 4, it says, well, and before I read it, in Ecclesiastes 3 through 4, we talked about how there was that labor in which we'll toil, how one generation passes, another comes, right? So we understand there's labor and there's death in the world. And those are two of the things first stated by God when, as part of the curse of sin on man, when sin first entered the world, that man would have to toil in the earth and that he would die. Solomon has called these things vanity, meaning one day they will end. Now we'll read Revelation 21, verse 4, and we'll find their end. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. But we understand death and toils, those will be cast out. Now, toils wasn't specifically named there in verse 21, but you can think of getting up and walking across the room. Well, that's a work. That's not really a toil, but you could imagine going and doing a work or an action that would give you pain. Well, now that's a toil. So I suppose with the casting out of pain and sorrow, just the same, the casting out of toils from our dictionary of actions from which we'll have. So that's an easy first one. And I think it's very interesting that the first two examples of vanity are also some of the first things that come into, or that are first two things that we're told will come into the world with sin, back in Genesis 3. But Solomon doesn't stop there. In Ecclesiastes 1 verse 5, it says, the sun also rises, and the sun goes down, and hastens to the place where it arose. Okay, this is another one of Solomon's vain things. He's listing it amongst all these vain things. Does the sun also have its end? When I go back to Revelation 21. Revelation 21 verse 23. Concerning New Jerusalem and the new creation, I suppose. Verse 23 of Revelation 21, it says, the city had no need of the sun or of the moon to shine in it, for the glory of God illuminated it. The Lamb is its light. We'll have no more need for a light that goes up or down, or for a light by night and a light by day anymore. We'll have the Lamb. We'll have the light of Christ, which will be our light, and the new creation. Back to Ecclesiastes. Verse 6. It says, the wind goes towards the south and turns around to the north. The wind whirls about continually and comes again on its circuit. So here the wind and its circuits, as it says in the New King James, are also listed amongst these vain things. Does the wind also have its end? We're going to go back to Revelation, but we're not going to go for once in this list, or maybe for one of two times in this list, we're not going to go to the Revelation 21. We're going to go to Revelation 7. Does the wind also have its end? In Revelation 7, verse 1, it says, after these things I saw four angels standing at the corners of the earth, holding the four winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, nor on the sea, or on any tree. Now, I want to make a note there that here these angels in Revelation 7:1 are given power to take hold of the wind. And you might say, is that really the end of the wind? And I can't say for certain, but I do know that you never see them release the wind. You never see them let it go again. But we see that they take hold of the wind and we never see them release it. And I just find it so interesting that even the wind in that prophecy that one day that'll end is there in Revelation. But we're not done with what we're doing in Ecclesiastes. Going back to Ecclesiastes, verse 7. And I have to give credit to my brother Joshua, because there's a verse in Revelation that never really caught my eye until he had brought it to my attention as something very curious. But here in Ecclesiastes 1:7, it says, all the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place from which the rivers come, there they return again. Is the sea also listed amongst these things which will stop existing? Well, Revelation 21 again. Revelation 21, verse 1. Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Also there was no sea. What a fun little remark there in the first verse of Revelation 21. And also there was no sea. So yes, even the sea has its end. Excuse all this turning around. We only have a couple more of these to go, and then this back and forth will slow down. In Ecclesiastes 1:8, it says, all things are full of labor. Man cannot express it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. So we're going to take a lesson from the couple examples we've looked at already and understand it's like, well, if this is a vain thing, then one day nothing will contain labor, and man will certainly express that. So if that's what we can understand to happen, since these all these things full of labor such that man cannot express it, nor eye satisfied with it, will one day stop existing, then we understand what kind of thing to look for. Man expressing how God has liberated them from labor and from dissatisfaction. And we see a picture of that, not exclusively in these verses in Revelation, but I found that these were the most fitting. It's also the shorter passage. In Revelation 5, verse 8 through 10, that has to do with John seeing the four creatures around the throne, the uncountable angels, and the 24 elders, and what they proclaim in the song that they sing. Here in Revelation 5, verses 8 through 10. Now, when he had taken the scroll, the four living creatures and 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each having a harp and golden bowls of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sang a new song, saying, "You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain and redeemed us to God by your blood out of every tribe, tongue, people, and nation, and have made us kings and priests to our God, and we shall reign on the earth." So someone might say, well, now hang on, James, back in Ecclesiastes 1, verse 8, it talked about how all things be full of labor, man cannot express it. And you said we would see a time where there would be nothing containing labor and man will express it. Well, as they said, it says these angels and these 24 elders, it says, for you were slain and redeemed us to God. Redeemed us from what? Of course, all the labors and toils and pains and things are included in that word redeemed, in those words redeemed us. So certainly we do find man expressing the satisfaction and the, as it says here in the beginning of the song that they sing, the worthiness of God to be the one who is able to do all these things. Back to Ecclesiastes 1. I think you all get a good idea of this kind of back forth exercise we're in. We'll be doing this for a couple more verses. In Ecclesiastes 1 verse 9, it says, that which has been is what will be. That which is done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. And here, much like all the other things Solomon has listed and declared vain, here even these statements have its vanity. Now, someone may say, oh, for now, things have been quite the same for a long time. Ideas so old that people in Greece had them long before maybe a 5-year-old had them, and things or of the modern day and stuff like that. Things we've heard and ideas and whatnot, they've been had. But here we're going to go to Revelation 21 again, and we're going to look for these new things under the sun. In Revelation 21, we're going to read verse 1 again. It says, now I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Also, there was no sea. So there we have our new heaven and our new earth. There will be new things under the sun. And while Solomon's statement describing the mundanity at which new things come about and how it seems things, you could say on earth have always seemed so regular, even as time goes on, that even one day all those things will end and we will have something called new. And speaking of things called new, we're going to read the next verse in Ecclesiastes 1:10. It says in Ecclesiastes 1:10, is there anything of which it may be said, see, this is new? It has already been in ancient times before us. So Solomon declares nothing new. And he says the status of nothing new. Well, it's listed amongst these vain things. So I suppose there'll be a time when someone won't be able to say, oh, that's not new, this isn't new. And we find that time once again in Revelation 21. We already talked about the new heaven and the new earth, but this next verse is quite poignant. In Revelation 21, verse 5, it says, then he who sat on the throne said, behold, I make all things new. And he said to me, right, for these words are true and faithful. So here, one day we will say very well, we'll say, see, this is new, and we'll mean it. And we'll call it new because God will call it new. Just as he called the new heavens new and New Jerusalem new. Now, in this kind of rapid fire back and forth we've been doing, this is the last one we'll do of those. And this time we're going to turn to Luke after we read from Ecclesiastes. So it's a bit different. But as you can see, I think I was pretty, let's say I stayed true to my statement that will be mostly in Revelation 21 previous. In Ecclesiastes 1:11, it says, there is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of things that are to come by those who will come after. It's a very interesting verse because it's a verse we very practically experience. Remembrance of former things. Do I know all the things that happened before me? No, not even a little bit. Even all of history is just the little shred that we have left. We know very little of the things which have come to pass in our history. And it says that there's also no remembrance of things that are to come. Well, I think we can all say, do we know everything to come? No, we certainly do not. No, Revelation is still a great mystery to us. Some of the things there and all the things not said, we can't possibly know those things, let alone say that, oh, we remember the things to come. Not just to say we know them, but to remember the things to come. That adds a layer to this of surely none of us can do this. But one day, all things backwards and all things forwards will be made clear to us, even obvious to us. In Luke 12, verse 2. Luke 12, verse 2, he says, and we're not going to stay in Luke too long. We're just going to be here for this verse. In in Luke 12, 2, it says, for there is nothing covered that will not be revealed, nor hidden that will not be known. So therefore, I suppose, and this is Christ that says this on, God goes and tells you, there is nothing covered that will not be revealed. I suppose then, all things before us and all things after us, these will be revealed to us, even to the degree that we may say, oh, I remember the thing that's to come. And we can say that and we'll mean it, and we'll be able to say that because it will have been revealed to us by God. We'll be able to say this to each other and be able to speak obviously to one another, like, oh, of course, this thing which will come. And that's an interesting, I find that to be a very deep thing to think about, considering the scope of eternity. To talk about the things which are to come, eternity won't be boring. There'll be things happening. Things we don't know yet, but Luke 12, verse 2 says, well, we'll know one day. God will show us. So as we've seen in the first 11 verses of Ecclesiastes, understanding the word vanity, and that vanity will also be cast away with sin, therefore all vain things must end one day, that's a very powerful tool. When Solomon said in the beginning, vanity, all is vanities, well, what is the vanity of vanities? I suppose that all vain things must end. When we read vanity of vanities, we say it with a smile. Better things are coming. Solomon defines this. So we've just done this exercise. Solomon goes and tells us what this exercise even was. In Ecclesiastes 1:12-14, he says, I, the preacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven, this burdensome task God has given to the sons of man, by which they may be exercised. I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and indeed all is vanity and grasping for the wind. Right? Solomon can, well, before I say other things he's done, here it says that this exercise that we've done was the product of seeking and searching out wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. Now there's a verse in Romans 1:20 that says that the attributes of God are visible in his creation. Well, from Solomon's exercise, we can add to that. Not only are God's attributes visible in creation, but even when we observe creation and we observe vain things, we can also say, God will also do this and do away with that, right? By observation, we don't just see God's attributes, we see the things that God will do. Solomon, I think, demonstrates that quite well in the exercise we just did. And as he goes and punctuates at the end, and indeed, all is vanity and grasping for the wind. Oh, and when he says the word all is vanity, we can remember back to when God said, behold, I make all things new. Right? So for him to say all things are vanity, well, isn't that truth? Right? God will cast out sin and vanity, and he will make all things new. And we might ask, how do all things contain vanity? And you can think about how all things, at least in the worldly way of speaking, contain sin. And another fun, I think kind of an Easter egg that's kind of there, that's a lot of fun. It says all is vanity and grasping for the wind. Well, we read a little bit earlier in Revelation 7:1, one day the angels will grasp for the wind and they'll catch it, such that it will not blow on the earth. So what? Yes, even that thing is such deliberate language. I think sometimes you wonder, reading the works of the prophets, like, oh, they reveal this much to us, but how much did they know? And in this message, which I'm giving today, we're only going to go through Ecclesiastes 1 and 2. We absolutely don't have time to do this exercise, this verse by verse exercise through 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way to chapter 12. But I'll tell you now, you can do that. And you'd say how much information could be concealed in things called vain. And I'd say a tremendous amount of things. A large portion of Revelation, I believe, or at least I have seen, is alluded to distantly, not so distantly in the sense that Revelation came so much later, right? As in terms of when it was written. But there's so much that is confirmed in Revelation that were first given, I think, in Ecclesiastes. And the key to understand all of it is just knowing what vanity is. Something that is linked to sin phenomenologically, and that will be cast out with sin just as well. So we're not done in Ecclesiastes. Here in Ecclesiastes 1:15, it says, what is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be numbered. So in validating Solomon's examples as prophetic declarations, we saw that it was God who brought all those vain things to an end. So when Solomon makes this remark, we understand that while man cannot name every vain thing or even understand how such things end or be corrected, we've only lived the life we've lived, right? That all of these things, the ability to end all these things and bring anew, all of these are within God's ability. So what is crooked cannot be made straight, not by us, but as we've seen in that exercise we've just completed, God is the one who can make straight what is crooked. God was the answer there, who is the one which will purify the world of sin, and just as well vanity jointly. This is God. So given that, we're going to go to the next two verses. In Ecclesiastes 1:16-18, it says, I communed with my heart, saying, look, I have attained greatness and have attained more wisdom than all who were before me in Jerusalem. My heart has understood great wisdom and knowledge, and I set my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceived that this also is grasping for the wind, for in much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases in knowledge increases in sorrow. Now those last verses there, that last statement here, Solomon, as we were told when he's defining the exercise we did, that he set his heart to know or concerning all things that were done under heaven, right? So Solomon, if you're trying to know all things done under heaven, you're trying to do something that only God can do completely. So in being so wise, Solomon learned something about God. You see, he said, for he in much wisdom, he said, for in much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases in knowledge increases in sorrows. Well then, so sure, Solomon's wise, and he's called wise like no other man, but he is not wise with a capital W like no other man. That is a title only given to Christ, who is God. So Solomon, in seeking out in all these things under heaven and seeking out wisdom, learned something about God. Because who has all wisdom and knowledge? Well, the answer is very easy, then it's God. Well, it says, for in much wisdom is much grief, and in much knowledge, much sorrow, right? So sure enough, God would come as a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. And of course, that is true in the pinnacle of the meaning, because when we say he contains all wisdom, it's entirely true. When we say he contains all knowledge, it is entirely true. So in the most capitalized way of saying it, he is the man of sorrows. I'll read in Isaiah 53, verse 3. He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. So here in Solomon, in the task which he did, learned something about God. And what he learned is an attribute of the Messiah, that the Messiah would come fully God. Well, I'll get into fully God, fully man in a moment, but he understood quite well. He will come and he will be a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. There are other details concerning what Solomon could understand concerning the nature of the Messiah. We'll get into those in chapter 2. We'll have a lot of fun with those. There's going to be a lot less turning around in the second half of this message, which we're about to get into. Ecclesiastes 2, verses 1 through 3. It says, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with mirth, therefore enjoy pleasure, but surely this also is vanity. I said of laughter, madness, and mirth, what does it accomplish? I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the sons of men to do under heaven in all the days of their lives. Emphasis on that last line just there. Till I might see what was good for the sons of man to do under heaven all the days of their lives. So let's ask ourselves that same question. What is good for man to do all the days of our lives? Well, we might think of that word good for a moment. It says, till I might see what was good for the sons of men to do under heaven. Well, we might recall the first time God used the word good in our Bibles, when he created the world and declared it good. And he put man there in the garden, and it was good. So if we had to think, what is good for the sons of men to do under heaven all the days of our lives, I don't think it'd be amiss for us, for our minds to go to the Garden of Eden and think about man in the garden. There's a lot I like to talk about concerning man in the garden. But here we can understand that Solomon, just like this conclusion that we just got to pretty easily, Solomon got to that conclusion just as easily and just as well. And Solomon could do something very few of us could do. Well, he acted on it. What do I mean? Well, we're going to read verses 4 through 8. It says, I made my works great. I built myself houses and planted myself vineyards. Interesting. I made myself gardens, even more interesting, and orchards, and I planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I'm going to pause there for a moment. You can think of a time when God made a garden and had fruit trees in them. And then it keeps going. It says, I made myself water pools from which to water the growing trees of the grove. And you might think of here, Genesis 2:10. God put a river to irrigate the garden. The river split into 4 river heads. All right, so it's an irrigated garden. All right, that's not too strange for garden. right? But God did it first, just saying. And it says, I'll read again. It says, I made myself water pools from which to water the growing trees of the grove. I acquired male and female servants and had servants born in my house. Yes, I had greater possessions and herds and flocks than all those who were in Jerusalem before me. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and special treasures of kings and of the provinces. I acquired male and female singers, the delights of the sons of man, and musical instruments of all kinds. So, our earlier way of thinking, how is man to live all the days of his life? And we might think of how man was first placed sinless in the garden. Well, Solomon, well, he thinks about the garden too, to the point that he even makes a little imitation. He makes a garden, vineyards, orchards, and poignantly he calls it a garden. He irrigates the garden as God irrigated the garden. And did God leave the garden empty? No, he put, as Solomon says, herds and flocks in there. He put, and it filled it with animals. And he didn't just fill it with animals. God took man and placed him in the garden. He didn't leave man there alone. He put a woman there as well. And just the same, Solomon said, I acquired male and female servants, and those went in there too, right? And, you know, it was the Garden of Eden, right? That's what the garden is of, right? It was in Eden, but the word Eden is also a quality or an attribute. The word Eden in Hebrew meaning delight. And as it says here in verse 8, the delights of the sons of men in musical instruments of all kinds. So he also filled it with delights. This is Solomon's garden of what? Of delights. So it's his imitation Garden of Eden. So Solomon tries this out, little social experiment, you could say. Does it advance humanity very far? Well, let's see what Solomon has to say about that. Verses 9 through 11 of chapter 2. It said, so I became great and excelled more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remains with me. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward from all my labor. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on the labor in which I had toiled, and indeed all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. So see, Solomon imitates the Garden of Eden. It doesn't really advance mankind much. It's nice. He's even greater than all the people before him in Jerusalem. That's nice. It doesn't do what the garden did. It doesn't have the attributes of the garden. We think of what made the garden special. It wasn't just its arrangement, which again, it was arranged perfectly by God. So it's a very special arrangement. But there's something even more special about the garden. And that it was there that sinless man was able to be within close proximity to God. Such that when sin entered man, man had to be put out of it. See, they had to be put out of this proximity of God. And they had to be put, I'll reiterate it, I'll just say it again, further away from the immediate presence of God. You know, God is everywhere, so the immediacy of his presence and how we talk about proximity matters when we talk about him. So Solomon's imitation of the garden could not bring man closer to God because it could not, it's just not something mankind is able to do, not on their own. No, in order for man to find that proximity that they once had, God would have to come down to us. And here Christ did that, and it's by that work of Christ that we will be made to be sinless in God's immediate presence again, not requiring the temple or the garden. I bring up the temple because even there, a man will go in the presence of God in the Holy of Holies. But here we will not require the garden nor the temple to be in God's immediate presence. I said that we were out of Revelation 21 for a moment. We're back in there just for a second. In Revelation 21, verse 22, it says, this is John observing the new heaven and the new earth. He says in verse 21, verse 22, but I saw no temple in it, for the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. We won't need something special to go before the immediate presence of God. It will be right there. And we understand it's not man who will do something to come closer to this proximity. No, it would have to be God to come down to us, right? Solomon's experiment failed. It didn't bring man closer to God. Therefore, God would have to be closer to man. And you might think, well, how close can God be to man? And that's the next subject we're going to talk about. Solomon, he's a king, and there aren't that many kings in the modern world where this is something we all think about often. I think about the many kings in the Middle East who I have nothing good to say about. And all the news about from these countries is always about, oh, who's the successor? Who's the crown prince? What's the crown prince going to do? So it's a very natural thing for a king to think about their successor. We're going to read about Solomon thinking about his successor in verses 12 through 14 of Ecclesiastes 2. It says, "Then I turned myself to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who succeeds the king? Only what he has already done? Then I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Yet I myself perceived the same events happens to them all." Solomon, as he says, for what can the man do who succeeds the king? So the word succeeds is about succession. Now Solomon has a direct descendant, Rehoboam, disastrous, big mess. But he has a much more significant descendant, something that Samuel revealed to David in 2 Samuel 7:16, here that the Messiah would come through the lineage of David, right? So Solomon has his direct successor, Rehoboam, disastrous, and he has the far more significant successor, right? And that is the Messiah, the one through whom, as Samuel had said to David, your throne, his throne will be eternal, right? Talking about the lineage and succession of David. Here, Solomon brings our attention where the way he says something, he says, "And I saw wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness." Now, between which of his successors would make him say that? The disastrous Rehoboam, or the much more significant descendant of his which would come? And he didn't know when he would come, but this other descendant, which is called the light, right? In John 8:12, it says, then Jesus spoke to them then Jesus spoke to them again, saying, "I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life." And remind you, it says back in Ecclesiastes, it says the fool walks in darkness, but those who walk in the light of the world, who is Christ, well, it says you shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life, right? So it says here Solomon has that grim thought about what his successor could be. Only what could he do? Only what the king has already done. And then he says, "Then I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness." And I think even Christ makes reference to this verse when he declares himself the light of the world in John 8:12. I'll read it one more time. Then Jesus spoke to them again, saying, "I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life." Wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. So this is the light which excels all folly. And in the New Testament, we seem to have this very poignantly pointed out to be Christ. But there's other things we can do in the book of Ecclesiastes to work out that this is Christ. And in fact, we can even work out something that Christ will do, something very important Christ will do. In Ecclesiastes 2:15 through 17, it says, "So I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. And why then was I more wise? Then I said in my heart, this also is vanity. For there is no more remembrance of the wise than of the fool forever, since all that now is will be forgotten in the days to come. And how does a wise man die as the fool? Therefore, I hated life, because the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me, for all is vanity and grasping for the wind. So Solomon says, how does the wise man die as the fool? Well, earlier, could make a distinction between Solomon's two successors. One is wise and the other is a fool. The fool is Rehoboam, of course, and the one who's wise is the one who contains all wisdom, right? That much more significant prophesied successor. So Solomon said earlier, here, that he saw wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. So you can connect the words fool and folly. What befalls a fool? Well, folly. What does a fool bring? Folly. What are the things a fool does? Folly, right? He's a fool. Folly is the defining characteristic of him, right? Or even connected similar words. Folly, fooly, connected words, right? So here, Solomon goes and says, and how does a wise man die as the fool, right? And certainly, yes, Christ, the much more significant descendant, the prophesied descendant, would die, right? That is true. One event happens, all Solomon says, well, he can consider both kinds of successors he has. But then he goes, well, I know that all men die, so surely even that one will die. But then Solomon had something earlier, a really useful thing that he worked out, right? That we can apply here. As I'll say it again, as that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. So we shouldn't be too surprised that this one who is the wisdom, who is the light, can excel the situation of the fool, right? As light excels darkness, right? So even though you may say, oh, well, the situation of death will happen to this one as well. Well, even this prophesied descendant, even Christ, would excel beyond the situation of the folly, right? If fools die, we all die, right? But Christ excels that. And I'll say it one more time just because I love it so much. Solomon, when he said, then I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness, right? Christ excels the situation of the fool, and he would rise from the dead. So yes, a certain thing does happen to all, right? Which is death. But that's not very consequential to Christ, right? And if we consider the exercise we did in the first 11 verses, we can understand it's like, well, who's the one who makes crooked what is straight? Well, that was God. We validated the way all these vain things end to be by God's hand. We can understand very well then that by a matter of who could end all these vain things, who is the successor to Solomon, the much more significant one, the one who even can excel the situation of something which all men otherwise experience. This one who's would be a man of sorrow and acquainted with grief, because, well, goodness, he is all knowledge and is all wisdom. He contains it all, right? We have strong illusions, maybe illusions isn't the right word, strong things pointing towards in the first 2 chapters of Ecclesiastes, that this prophesied descendant of Solomon, the much more significant descendant than all other descendants of Solomon, is God, and that he'd be fully God and fully man. Now, that's just as far as you'll get with Ecclesiastes 1 and 2. You can actually get all the way there with the rest of Ecclesiastes. We don't have the time tonight to do that. Here, we went through every verse between Ecclesiastes 1 and 2 so far, and we're not done yet. We just have a couple more verses to go. We're going to finish chapter 2, and that'll be it for tonight. Because goodness, once you start chapter 3, there's the chapter 3. You can remember how chapter 3 begins. There's a time for this, a time for that. And that kind of momentum, well, it requires its own message. That's a lot of momentum, a lot like the back and forth we had in the beginning of this message in Ecclesiastes 1. Anyways, we're going to finish reading Ecclesiastes 2, and we're going to see what we can make of it. We have a good bit left. We're going to read between 18 to 23, and then we're going to read the remaining verses. Ecclesiastes 2, 18 to 23. Then I hated all my labor, which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool. Yet he will rule over all my labor, which I toiled, and in which I have shown myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity. Therefore I turned my heart and despaired of all the labor in which I had toiled under the sun. For there is a man whose labor is with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, yet he must leave his heritage to a man who has not labored for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. For what has man for all his labor and for the striving of his heart with which he has toiled under the sun? For all his days are sorrowful and his work burdensome. Even in the night, his heart takes no rest. This is also vanity. Ooh. When Solomon says all these things that, oh boy, they're pain sayings, they're things we can read and say, oh yeah, that it hurts, right? And then he calls all that vanity. He goes, well, I suppose one day we'll be freed of that. So without thinking about that too much, let's think about the rest of what Solomon said here. Here, Solomon understood, regardless of which descendant would come, that when they would, he understood regardless of which descendant would come and whichever would come first, right? It doesn't matter which one came first or when either would come, right? That his works are in vain. His foolish son Rehoboam would inherit his, Solomon's vain works. And it's like, well, all right, he's not going to get further than Solomon, right? And just the same, the son of prophecy, just Christ, would not inherit Solomon's works at all. So in that sense, Solomon could be working up, create such a great kingdom. Even that is not going to the son of prophecy. Why? Because Christ has a much greater inheritance than anything you or I could ever give him, right? He makes the world new. But the inheritance of Christ will be the new creation. And I refer, of course, to the perfected church, which will be his bride, and the new heaven, and also the new earth, and all kinds of things which we don't understand yet. You see, Solomon did all that he did. If it goes to one, it's vanity. If it goes to the other, well, then it's all going to go away anyways, because, well, the inheritance of Christ is so much greater than anything we could ever give him. So, yes. So in thinking about giving things to God, right? Solomon could understand, as well as us, in the way that we understand salvation and God's mercy and grace, that there's no such thing as a transactional relationship with God, right? What could you give him? He made everything. He's God, right? So what could you give him? Well, you can keep that in mind in the last two verses of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes 2, 24 to 26. Nothing is better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. For who can eat, or who can have enjoyment more than I? For God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight. But to the sinner he gives the work of gathering and collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. So here a distinction is made. It says, for God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good. Okay. But then it says to the sinner, he gives the work of gathering and collecting. Well, as it is now, right? All the best among us are also sinners. So these two categories are there's a large Venn diagram between them as far as we can call good and who we can call sinners. But Solomon says, this also is vanity and grasping for the wind. One day, that way those categories form a Venn diagram, they will not do that anymore. One day, it'll be that the righteous will be perfected in righteousness and set apart in righteousness with God, and the sinful will be set apart on their own, separate from God. So these categories which Solomon brings up, these ones that have such a great Venn diagram, such a great overlap between them, and he calls that vanity. One day there won't be. One day God will sort all things into one and the other. There are many verses we could use to connect to this realization. But if you had to consider the gathering and collecting, it talks about how God has given that as a work to be done, this work of gathering and collecting. If you wanted to connect these verses, the understanding that God will sort all things, and also include that little phrase, the gathering and collecting, well, we have a little bit of time left. And I thought, well, maybe if I go long, I won't turn here, but it looks like we will. I think Christ refers to this task in a parable, the parable of the 3 servants in Matthew 25. We're going to read this. We're going to find that it tracks quite well with the example given at the end of Ecclesiastes 2, this gathering and collecting. And we're going to find it indeed, for lack of a better word, jives with the understanding of things being sorted by God in the end. Here, Matthew 25, starting in verse 14, we're going to go to 30. For the kingdom of heaven is like a man traveling to a far country, who called his servants and delivered his goods to them. And to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to each according to his own ability. And immediately he went on a journey. Then he who had received the 5 talents went and traded with them and made another 5 talents. So here we see the beginning of this gathering and collecting, right? We see the beginning of this gathering and collecting here in Matthew 25, here in verse 16. It says in verse 17, and likewise, he who had received 2 gained 2 more also. But he who had received 1 went and dug in the ground and hid his Lord's money. After a long time, the Lord of those servants came and settled accounts with him. So he who had received 5 talents came and brought 5 other talents, saying, Lord, you delivered to me 5 talents. Look, I have gained 5 more talents besides them. His Lord said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a few things. I will make you a ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your own Lord. In verse 22, it says, he also who had received 2 talents came and said, Lord, you delivered to me 2 talents. Look, I have gained 2 more talents besides them. His Lord said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a few things. I will make you a ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. So here, so far, we have 2 servants that have done their jobs. One has done, you could say, the maximal effort and the maximal return, and the other has done more minimally what he's done, but he's done his job. What about this 3rd servant? It says, then he, in verse 24, then he who had received the 1 talent came and said, Lord, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. And I was afraid and went and hid your talent in the ground. Look, there you have what is yours. But the Lord answered and said to him, you wicked and lazy servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. So you ought to have deposited my money with the bankers, and at my coming I would have received back my own interest. Therefore, take the talent from him and give it to him who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has, more will be given. and he will have abundance. But from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away, and cast the unprofitable servant into the outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So here we've seen servants that are much like us in the sense that they live in the way that we do. Sure, they're good, but they're also sinners. They're a lot, the overlap is, well, they exist within it. And we see them gathering and collecting, and we see them do different, they do this all to different ends. And we see that in this parable which Christ gives, right? It's like, oh, those who have done this well, even minimally, right? Oh, you will enter in, as it says, enter into the joy of your Lord. And for those which hide away, right? They don't realize the profit for what's given to them, right? Well, as it says in verse 30, and cast the unprofitable servant into the outer darkness, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So we understand very well the meaning of this parable, that there's a way things are now. Those which are good, well, they will be set apart to be in the joy of the Lord, right? And those which were not, right? Those, when God divides all things and we're left with very clear categories of righteous and sinful, right? Well, we see here very well what happens to the sinful, the weeping and the gnashing of teeth. So I liked this connection so much because of the many ways you could connect the last 4 verses of Ecclesiastes to that a parable seemed to fit it just so absolutely well with this gathering and collecting, and also fits the initial interpretation which we could achieve without even knowing this parable. I thought it was a lot of fun. Well, that's all I have from Ecclesiastes 1 and 2, because we've gone through every verse of Ecclesiastes 1 and 2, and I've said all I could possibly say. Well, for this message, I said all I could possibly say. And one day we might go to other verses of Ecclesiastes, other chapters of Ecclesiastes, much how we did 1 and 2 here. We might do 3 and 4 another time. I don't mean to make a series out of it, but I find Ecclesiastes to be such a remarkable trove of prophecy, things that God could do. The idea that here someone once mocked Revelation 1:20, I think some guy in the Middle Ages. Here, Revelation 1:20 is that you could observe creation and understand the attributes of God, right? Someone said, well, sure, I guess if I looked at creation, I'd say, well, this looks like a creation that would look a lot like a God who'd make this creation, right? He didn't see much of a jump between the observation and understanding the attributes of God, right? But here Solomon goes and shows us, oh, the depth here is so much greater, right? That you can look at creation, not just understand the attributes of God, but understand things which God will go on to do, right? And Ecclesiastes is full of it. I'll say it just to slam a point home before I close in prayer. The vanity of vanities is that all vain things will end, and that's a beautiful thing. And that's a tool that if you figure that out, Ecclesiastes becomes a beautiful book. One that is much more navigable and certainly not depressing, as some commentators may have you think. Anyways, let's close in prayer. Our Father, we thank you for your perfect word. We thank you that even in a creation marred by sin, that it's a task that you've given man, even a burdensome task, to be able to look at it and say, God will do this, and you will do all these things which you've revealed to us, Lord, even more. And we know that as we explore your word, there are so many more things that you could reveal to us and even will in our lifetimes. But we know that when you end all vain things, when you cast out sin, make all things new, that all your works, as your servant John said, works which could fill books and books such that the earth could not contain them, that there we get an idea of what eternity has in store for us. Thank you for your word. Amen.